Welcome to ENG 328, Study Session 4. John Pepper Clark, Social Political Commitment. Introduction. John Pepper Clark was born in 1935 in Kiagbodo in the Western Delta region of Nigeria. He was educated at Umuahia and Ibadan. Clark is one of the foremost poets in Africa and a contemporary of Wole Soyinka and Christopher Okigbo, who published Clark's early poetry. Clark has written 10 poems in which he laments Okigbo's tragic death. In this study session, you will learn about his life, the style of his poems, and social realities informing them. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Identify the major issues and the atmosphere of Clark's early poems. 2. Discuss the themes of Clark's socio-political poetry collections. Early poems. J.P. Clark is one of Africa's foremost poets whose poetic career spanned from the pre-independence era. His poems could be categorized into philosophical, nature, sensuous, social, and political poems. Clark's first 4 collections of poetry poems, 1962, A Reed in the Tide, 1965, Casualties, and A Decade of Tongues, 1981, not only reflect his developing poetic sensibility, but also point to emerging social vision and voice. Poems contains most of his early poetry previously published in The Horn, a literary magazine for creative writing. The second collection, A Reed in the Tide, contains most of the key poems from the first collection and nearly all his poems about the United States. It is remarkable for its central image of people as both children and victims of nature. We also have the images of post-colonial Nigeria. A Decade of Tongue is a combination of poems from these earlier collections. A Decade of Tongue are explications of individual childhood experience. The collection is loaded with personal images of a world through which the poet has forged from the childhood days in his native community. Clark conveys the innocent wonder of the child in the newness of everything, a novelty of experience inquisitively. In Streamside Exchange, riverbird, riverbird, sitting all day long, on hook over grass, riverbird, riverbird, sing to me a song of all that pass and say, will mother come back today? 1962, Ditto 20. According to Osita Okagwe, an atmosphere of peace pervades the entire landscape of poems, with an occasional hint that nature can be capricious and the world an unkind place. In the second part of the poem, for instance, the birds refuse that the child's mother is never coming back. 2002, Ditto 155. This theme is also present on Abiku, where the born-to-die child persists in tormenting the unfortunate mother, and Night Rain, where even though the child's innocent fascination at the water drops, telling like orange or mango or fruit showered forth in the wind, 1962, Ditto 6. One is horror that not only the poor family sleep is threatened, but also their home and lives are at risk of being washed away by the rain. Clark's strength as a poet are exuberant, and his remarked ability to capture the picture and rhythm of the Delta Camoescape girl in Agbo Dancer, or the sprawling Nisty City of Ibadan, 2002, Ditto 155. A Read in the Tide contains the experience with poems. Flight Across Africa recalls the journey away from home forward this new experience of another culture brought about by the catalyst event of Ibie. A Read in the Tide reflects Clark's quest out of his native Ijaw environment and begins to reflect on the larger Nigerian context in poems like Emergency Commission, which treats of the political upheavals and state of emergency in the western region of Nigeria, and The Leader, which is about Obafemi Awolowo, who unannounced home from abroad wrestled to a standstill his champion, causing the Killer of Cows, 1965, Ditto 36. There is also Cuba Confrontation, a reference to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis between the United States and the Soviet Union America. America, their America, 1964. This collection suggests that his experience in the United States was not a very pleasant one. Such incidents as when he was told to bathe more often, or when he was told he was an embarrassment to the entire group on a tour to the Pavin Center, show the extent of the severed relationship which he had with his hosts. Finally, the hasty manner of his departure from the country asked to leave. According to Akagbue, he was on the whole, the American experience marks a turning point in Clark's career. From then on, he was no longer the private romantic concerned with expressing the personal experience in poetry that is sometimes very intimate and privately allusive, but always lyrical. As a result of his visit to the United States, Clark began writing public poems. According to Kolawole Ogungbesan, a foremost Nigerian critic, the writer is a member of a society and his sensibility is conditioned by the social and political happenings around him. 1972, Ditto 5. Clark's commitment to socio-political happening around him is a product of his rich intellectual background and the fact that he ranks amongst the first of African writers to emerge on the continent prior to the exit of the colonialists. In the words of Egudu, African poetry is intimately concerned with the African people in the African society, with their life in its various ramifications: cultural, social, economic, intellectual, and political. 1978. It is in this regard that we shall consider Clark's commitment as contained in Casualties, 1970, and State of the Union, 1985, and Mandela and Other Poems, 1988. Socio-political concerns in Clark's poetry. Casualties. Casualties in J.P. Clark's contribution to the Nigerian Civil War literature. In the collection, the remote and immediate causes of the war are highlighted. He goes ahead to bring out the futility of the war and its effect on the people whose community became theater of war. The political predicament of Nigeria since she became independent in 1960 is also highlighted. In Vulture Choice, Clark sees Nigeria as a vulture, a bird of bad omen that symbolizes cannibalism and death at various times. Nigeria, having been granted independence, finds it difficult to stand on her feet just as a vulture whose wedlock for 6 years, just like Nigerians' first civilian experience, epitomizes futility. The vulture wanted a child. 6 years was a long time to be married. I'm no child. What if another and child should die? Then I shall eat both for right. 1970. This particular poem can be given two interpretations. First, Clarke sees the independence granted Nigeria in 1960 as a fragile arrangement which could collapse. The political setup, which was fashioned on the British parliamentarian model, could not serve the best interests of the Anglophone West African masses. Politicians at that era were too self-centered to allow the model succeed. Consequently, the 6 years of independence in Nigeria was characterized by political chaos, arson, killings, thuggery, unjustified detention, and looting of the national treasury. Secondly, in Clarke's explanatory note to the poem, he says the poem explains the dilemma or choice facing the 1966 coup plotters on the likely outcome of the coup. The atrocities perpetrated by the Nigerian political class at that time were many and great, that it was not long before the 5 young majors seized power in order to breast a festival of flood and stem a tide, that is, to prevent greed, avarice, and corruption in high places. The atrocities which the 5 military officers considered sufficient for the military takeover of government are contained in Seasons of Omens. When Calabash held patrol and men turned faggots in the streets, then came the 5 hunters. When claws were discovered that were not in the book, and cattle counted for heads of men. 1970. In this poem, justification for the coup is given as arson, falsification of 1963 census figure, rigging. To Clarke, these happenings facilitated the disaster and Holocaust that was to overwhelm the Nigerian society. In the usurpation, Clarke recounts the period of uncertainty immediately after the coup. Some of the plotters had fled and there was no government in place. Surprise, horror, and pandemonium gripped the entire country as there was a kind of vacuum. The evil of war and the loss of friends and relations are recounted in Skill and Cope, where Clarke laments the deaths of the friends. In The Death of a Weaver Bird, he laments the death of Christopher Okigbo, a fellow poet and friend. According to R.N. Egudu, Clarke has succeeded in creating for us, by means of a series of metaphors and many other literary devices, unmistakable pictures of the futility and sorrows of our historic wars. 1978. To Egudu, Clarke's war poems are artistic sources. The image of flood, dragon, hawk, fire, funeral pile, and madness, which describe the war, are effective for their vigor and clarity. Casualty is a journey through madness and hell, but in spite of its bleak outlook, it ends in hope. State of the Union. In the collection State of the Union 1985, Clarke reflects and refracts on a number of issues in the society. Reading through the poem, one finds nothing dignifying about the monstrous political alchemy called Nigeria, the sovereign. Clarke's indirect and weary irony is appropriate for presenting the unwholesome picture of a country where nothing works. This is the subject and title of the first poem, Here Nothing Works. Here nothing works services taken for granted elsewhere either break down or do not get started at all. Well introduced here, 1985. There is no doubt that Clark in this poem is engaged in an appraisal of social services in Nigeria, water supply, electricity, telephone, road network, and aviation are strange to our land. In The Cleaners, Clark criticizes political office holders who sees nothing in whatever their predecessors had done. Return of the Heroes recount the return of Biafran warlords from exile. In it's typical of Nigerian government to grant state pardon to such people and even allow them to contest election on the platform of the ruling party. Easter 1976 highlights the execution of the plotters of the February 1976 coup, in which General Murtala Muhammad, the then head of state, was assassinated. Victoria Highland highlights occupation of family land by the government and the allocation to themselves, cronies and foreigners. In Sacrifice and Song of the Retired Public Servant, Clark laments the plight of those who had served Nigerian meritoriously. Some who have even lost a limb, probably, or even life, do not have anything to show for the love they have for their country. One Country shows the plight of the people of the Niger Delta who, in spite of the fact that the nation's wealth is derived from their soil, they suffer most in the Nigerian Federation. They draw waters up country from the rivers. The aborigines upon the banks are left dry in their tenements. 1985. The Sovereign is a poem which Clark criticizes the amalgamation of Nigeria and the so-called oneness of the country. He says, it was never a union. It was at best an amalgamation. 1985. Clark sees the forceful unification of over 400 tribes without a common link as fake and unworkable. However, the meager and controlled passion in this collection, the rich allusions and complete metaphors that give casualties a depth of emotion and intensity of language seem remarkably absent from State of the Union. In spite of the starkness, some of the poems achieve a brilliance and potency of image that one has come to associate with Clark's poetry. Mandela and Other Poems. Mandela and Other Poems, 1988, has 3 parts. Ceremonies for Departure and Departed cast a recessive light on the controlled image of Mandela. The first section, entitled Mandela, deals with the liberation struggle in South Africa, which the poet believes in taking too long to conclude. The title poem, Mandela, looks at the life of Nelson Mandela as he wastes away in the Robben Island prison and at the huge sacrifices that the struggle entails for all its leaders. This section also celebrates great freedom fighters like Samora Machel of Mozambique and the heroic children of Soweto who, afraid to die in the concentration camp he has made of their land, stampede barbed wire and bullets, 1988-9. According to Okagbue, nothing in Mandela comes close to the haunting beauty of the poetry of ceremonies for departure and departure. The two are made up of a series of elegies on the subject of death, a brooding sense of loss of close friends and relatives to the vagrant guests, whom no one wants but everyone must entertain someday. 2002, Ditto 160. Mandela and other poems are exceptionally moving. In them, Clarke achieves a unique fusion of emotion, imagery, and language to produce poetry that is part elegiac, part nostalgic, and part resigned rumination on the passing of time. All others spelled of day moves on into night, the coming of age. 1988, Ditto 47. The collection does not end quite so hopelessly, for its last poem, The Order of the Dead, promises a life after death. The dead of this land praising God, or may come again into town as children, if at their first coming, or they went away with a sign of great wrong. 1988, Ditto 36 to 37. According to Okagbue, the modification of Clarke's tragic vision provides the hope that rescues the volume from its pervasive sense of registration to the finality of death, a view that is not particularly African for his readers. This is not the end of the road, for there is life and poetry after middle age. Study session summary. Going by our review of Clarke's poetry, we can conclude Clarke shows his concern for the plight of members of his society and the instability which is characteristic of war situations, the end result of which is always sorrow, agony, and death. Clarke also quests outside Anglophone West African to explore the plight of South Africa. We've come to the end of study session 4. Thanks for listening.